Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we are joined by Zachary Ottenstein, and we will be discussing what I believe is our first discussion surrounding the Minchas Yitzchak on the podcast. And I'm very excited about this because perhaps the Minchas Yitzchak is often brought in as a foil, as a contrast to Moshe Feinstein's positions in the Igros Moshe. But it's about time that we give him some of his well-deserved attention in the spotlight. And of course, to have a longtime listener, fan of the show, and scholar in his own right, Zachary Ottenstein, who is a resident of Manhattan's East Side, teaches in the English department at Bicultural Hebrew Academy High School in a place known as Stamford, Connecticut, that I've heard of. Before coming to Bicultural, he taught at the Rabbi Jacob Joseph School of Staten Island and TABC. He studied for 2 years at Yeshivat Eretz Tzvi, where he was privileged to learn under distinguished Talmidei Chachamim, including Rav David Ebner Shlita and Rav Simcha Kraus Zichron Livracha. He holds a BA from Yeshiva College in History and Judaic Studies and learned under the tutelage of Rav Jeremy Weeder and Rav Baruch Simon. I see you got a good combo of kulas over there. Receiving the Honig Award for Excellence in Talmud upon his graduation. Currently, he is completing a Master's in Social Studies Education at Teachers College, Columbia University, and learning independently for Smicha as well. It is exciting. I always find it exciting when we bring someone on the show who is not a rabbi by trade, though possesses the wisdom of one, whose expertise is more in the fields of the Mada than the Torah, but we'll see the Torah will certainly shine through as well. So, perhaps before we jump into the tshuva, maybe just briefly, what is the topic of the tshuva, just like the one-liner, and then how about orient myself? What should I know about the Minchas Yitzchak?
Sure. So before I say anything else, first of all, I want to give thank you to you for having me on the show. Really, really a pleasure to be here, Rev Kurtz. And I also got to give a thank you to Rabbi Steve Gottlieb, for
Uh,
making the introduction.
he's like the puppet master of all of modern Orthodoxy. He's like behind everything.
Yeah. So I got to thank Rabbi Steve Gottlieb for introducing me to you and for, yep, really running the show as it comes to book reviews and everything to really do with the modern Orthodox blogosphere. Still say
he, he
blogosphere,
is
I'm
he,
sure.
he is like the adhesive that connects all of modern Orthodoxy. But at any rate, so the Minchas Yitzchak.
Yes, so the Minchas Yitzchok to me represents post World War II Hungarian Orthodoxy transplanted to Western Europe at its finest. And I know that's a very, very niche designation, but to me that really is a unique thing. The Minchas Yitzchak grows up in Hungary among the Satmar Hasidim, even though not being a Satmar Chassid himself, he grows up among the Satmar Hasidim. He then hides during the war and eventually post World War II is invited by the chief rabbi of the UK, Rabbi Israel Brody, who was actually the chief rabbi of England when my grandparents, Aleim Shalom, were living in England, got married.
Ah,
So their wedding license, their wedding certificate is done under the auspices of Chief Rabbi Israel Brody.
hmm.
Kind of piece of family history there. Just unique things that happened, I guess, in the 50s that don't happen now. My grandparents got married Erev Shavuos, which is a thing that you would not see which is a thing you would not see
Must have been a lot
in,
of cheesecake there at the reception.
yes. So, but, so definitely there's that personal connection to UK Jewry as a whole and to Minchas Yitzchak.
What did he go by?
I'm sorry?
So what did the Minchas Yitzchak go by? What did people call him?
Well, he was the Dayan of the he was the Av Beis Din of Manchester.
So right, he usually went by Dayan by that as his initial title. So that's interesting. So you're saying he started from Eastern Europe, made his way over to Western Europe, but his Torah seems to have been shared much more widely than just within Europe.
Correct. So I think, you see references to the Minchas Yitzchak in much of, call it contemporary chuvos, and then I meant, eventually after he retired from serving as Dayan in Manchester, he eventually is appointed to the Eda Charedis in Yerushalayim, where he lived out the rest of his years. I believe he died. What was the year he died? Sometime. I'm going to say 1989. Does that sound right? But He died sometime, the 80s or the 90s. I'm much better with birth dates than yard sites.
That's
Um,
good. And so what's the topic that he's addressing? He was very prolific. You just go on Bar Ilan notes or if you happen to own a set of Minchas, it's like I don't own a hard copy set, but he was very prolific. He wrote on, I mean, I can't say everything, but feels like virtually Kol Torah Kula. So what is the topic out of all of the volumes that he has written? What is the topic that you've chosen for us today?
Yeah, so this tshuva is a tshuva that covers actually seemingly three sort of disparate topics. He starts off with addressing the question of a daughter saying Kaddish in a public setting in a
Hmm.
shul, and responding to an article from Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin Zatzal in, I believe it's Hapardes, an
Yeah.
earlier article of his in
We actually
Hapardes.
we actually did have an episode a while back where we talked about women saying Kaddish, and I believe we actually that was one of the main texts that we looked at was his article in Hapardes, Rav Yosef Elio Hankin. That's another good name of 20th century Rabbanim who kind of got a little bit overshadowed by Rav Moshe Feinstein, but certainly were huge poskim and figures in their own right.
Absolutely. And then he moves on to a seemingly completely unrelated issue in this tshuva, and it deals with, of all things, textbooks in the Cheder, Yeshiva Katana, whatever you want to call it, of a certain Hasidic dynasty in Brooklyn, where these textbooks that they had, where they would learn history from these textbooks, spells the name of Avram Avinu, who at one point, you could say, Yudas Hadoras here, that at one point in history textbooks, the Genesis narratives surrounding Abraham were assumed to be history, they were assumed to be fact, and they were included in history textbooks. They told the story of Abraham and everything that happened to him, much in the same way you tell the story of Abraham Lincoln, Lahavdil. Um, um,
That's interesting. So you're saying is that textbooks back in the day, I mean, I guess coming from more of a Christian background, just took for granted that just as a member of society, you should know the biblical narrative, and this was accepted as general history. And I mean, it's been a while since I've cracked open a high school history textbook. Does it make no mention of it anymore? I mean, where does history begin?
so that's a
Ancient
very good question.
Mesopotamia and something happened over there.
Yeah, so depending on the textbook and depending on how up to date your whatever school keeps up with buying new editions of textbooks, we can talk about how it's the biggest racket in the textbook industry
Oh
is the
my
biggest
gosh,
racket.
it's a whole scheme. I mean, academia in general. I mean they have to keep pumping out new editions. That otherwise they won't be able to make more money in sales.
Yeah, but really, a history textbook that I'm familiar with, I'm forgetting the exact edition that I used when I was teaching history, is that they sort of start the way they phrase it is they start with the Bias Rishon period as regards the origin of what we call Judaism, what they call, Israelite religion, as it were.
Hmm.
And they'll say that the Israelites understood themselves to be the descendants of Moshe, who had revealed the law to them at Mount Sinai, and before that,
So that's like the shtick. Like if you're a reporter, right? So you don't want to make a certain assertion, so you say some experts have claimed, and then you insert what your opinion really was. So now it doesn't have a shame op-ed piece. Now it has a shame reporting. But really, that was like the point you wanted to get to. So I see the Israelites thought of themselves as descending from Abraham or Abram, or that seems to be the topic of the tshuva. You want to tell us
correct. And I
about
will
that?
just throw in here a conversation that I had with Professor Barry Eichler at Yeshiva College when I was in his class, that he always used to say, you cannot necessarily locate the name Avram Avinu in any Mesopotamian document, in in any archaeological finds or any tablet. But he says, based on he's a great ancient Near East scholar, you can really place Avraham in a real historical context and understand the realia of what was happening in the period that we think of as the patriarchal era.
Interesting.
So,
So no record necessarily of an Avraham per se, but the things that are being described that took place, the milieu, that certainly is well attested to. So okay, so these are textbooks that are in a Jewish school, and what's the issue that emerges from them? That it has to come all the way to his desk, that he has to
yeah.
paskin a halacha of some sort.
Yeah, so we have the Gemara in Brachos, and Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph quotes in the name of Bar Kapara that there is an Isser to call Avraham Avinu Abram or Avram. That they're, in English you would spell the contemporary way to spell Abraham, as he's referred to in English, would be Abraham, Abraham.
Hmm.
But we see sometimes, often as a surname, the last name Abram, 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 or
Right. And I
something
like
of
that
that
in at least
nature.
in the edition that's on Bar Ilan, they actually have the English letters in there. It's not even transliterated; it's actual English letters, which you don't always see in a tshuva sefer. Abraham or Abram, or I see Abraham apparently is in here as well.
Well, yeah, so then, what I think makes this tshuva such a fascinating piece of rabbinic literature is, first of all, Dayan Weiss's seeming understanding of English literary conventions and spelling conventions. And he even questions this idea that if there's a language out there that doesn't have an H sound, the hard H, the huh, but instead they use G's or J's, often as you'll see in Spanish, such as in the word jalapeno, which is spelled with a J,
Uh-huh.
accent at the beginning of the word, what would you do in that case? Where, could be in theory spelled abragam, but that G is not meant to be a hard G sound.
Interesting. So, if I'm understanding correctly, there's a Gemara that says, since Hashem changed over the name from Avram to Avraham, it's now usher to call him to refer to him by Avram. And the issue is that these textbooks, which I guess by today's standards are ostensibly very from, that they're even talking about this in the first place, they refer to him as Abram or Avram, not by Avraham. So the issue is it mutter to teach this in the this is funny. I mean, in the grand scheme of things of what could be put, issues that come up with textbooks in yeshivas. I mean, evolution, I guess, a little bit. I think the Christians, at least in my experience, the Christians are much more concerned about teaching evolution. Not to say like the yeshiva schools aren't at all, but I feel like that's just like not as much for some reason of like a same theological problems are raised. We had a bigger issue. I remember when I went to Yeshiva High School, so I remember in the Masifta, they made a much bigger deal about learning the chapter in biology about reproduction. I think I still remember chapter 4. We even remember the number. And they had to switch teachers that day. And they brought in one of the Rebbeim. And one of the Rebbeim had to teach a chapter. And he started off with this whole thing from the Zohar about male and female. And, all the Olamos Elyonim were spinning around as he was talking. And I'm not sure I learned anything from it in terms of being prepared for the regents or the APs. But, that seemed to be the much more controversial content to teach. So, in the grand scheme of things, this seems like a very minor question that's coming to his desk, or maybe I just don't appreciate the gravity of what the Gemara is saying.
Yeah, so I mean, seemingly, the Gemara seems to be saying, and the way that certain poskim understand this is that, if you call Avraham Avram, you could be your over and ase and a los ase. So again,
Really?
yeah.
It's like it's in the 613, or how did it? How
Well,
does?
that's you're moving us along in the chuva here because that's one of the things that Diane Wise brings up is that seemingly this isn't really codified anywhere, and it doesn't seem to be part of minyan hamitzvos as we understand it.
Right, you
Um,
open up a Sefer Chinuch, there's hardly anything in Sefer Bereshis. So I'm kind of surprised by that. So okay, maybe instead of me jumping the gun on the tshuva, so okay, break it down for us. So how does he address this seeming issue with the textbooks versus the Gemara?
so yeah, so the tshuva itself, he begins with this component of discussing the English linguistics, as it were, as regards the tshuva. Um, but then he goes into a much larger discussion of, first of all, he brings the actual makor for the Isser and how the Magin Avram seems to quote this lahalacha. The Magen Avram and Simon Kuf Nun Vav seems to bring this lahalacha that Hakorel Avram Avram over Ba'ase Velosase.
Ah, okay. So and the Magen Avram is not just some random little thing tucked away in a Likud Sefer somewhere. It's one of the chief Nosei Kalim we have in the Shulchan Aruch. So the fact that one might dismiss it and say, okay, it was a one-off agadita. We don't really paskin this way. If it made its way into the Magen Avraham, that's something that we need to reckon with, actually.
Correct. And he quotes a Beis Shmuel. He quotes a Beis Shmuel. Um,
Ishmael as well.
he quotes a Beis Shmuel, which talks about how the default name, the default spelling, the Beis Shmuel is dealing with spellings for Gittin.
Hmm.
He's dealing with spellings for Gittin, and the default spelling, if someone tells you my name is Avram, you spell it Aleph Beis Resh Hey Mem Sophiz. You spell it Avram, and that the Beis Shmuel doesn't seem to even understand the concept how someone could have the name Avram.
Right. Once you're going out of your way over there, why would you name someone Avram instead of Avraham? I mean, once you already appreciate that there's this patriarch of the Jewish people, wouldn't you want to go with the name he gets after God blesses him with that extra hey?
Correct, and that yeah, meaning Avraham we have a clear is one of the times in the Torah we have a clear time where Hashem tells the change of the name. You will no longer be called X, you will be called Y, and explains the reason why he is changing
Right. It sounds
the name.
almost like one is denying Hashem's will. Hashem renamed Abraham, and who are we to misidentify him by his original name that he had?
Correct. So then what to me, what is an interesting part of this tshuva is in Os Beis, where he quotes from many, many different Rishonim and Achronim, but he also talks about the fact that there are people who have nicknames based on the name Avraham that are not Avraham Dafka, and even people who he quotes Gam Eitzah Hamedaktikim, even people who seem to be very medactic in halacha seem to be people who are knowledgeable. They have names for their children that are not Avram. B'shem Avram Lekitzer, Hashem Me Avraham, O Avramo, L'Shem
Dremel. Ah, I like
Piguim,
that.
Yotzev is that. Maybe not in Stanford or the Upper East Side. You're not going to meet many Avramos, um, but especially Eastern Europe and maybe in the Hasidic community, Avramel is a very perhaps common
Right,
nickname.
Avrami, Avremel. It's so these are so right. Would these also not saying Avram, but would these also be in violation of the, I guess we'll call for lack of a better term, Isser that the Gemara mentions?
Correct. So seemingly not. He seemingly, he just, based on the poskim that he's quoting, dismisses this idea that, even making a nickname out of the name Avram.
I guess the if we want to like give the Chakira, is the issue Dafka saying Avram or is the issue not saying Avraham? So
Correct. And
we can go with the former.
one of the other issues he brings up here is the question of, are you doing it l'shem zilzol or not?
Mm.
And that is really not a small thing to quote. If you call your child Avrami or Avremel or Avi, let's say,
Yeah.
as a nickname, as a term of endearment, versus calling him Avram with no hey as some sort of zilzul on Avram Avinu, then that could also be a possible distinction
So would
to
we
make.
assume that the textbook choosing Avram over Avraham is intended as some kind of zilzal, some kind of, denigration of his status? Is that how we have to understand it?
I don't think so. I think perhaps, I'm not familiar with the exact textbook that, this Hasidic Cheder was
That'd be
using
interesting,
again
yeah, to
decades
uh
ago.
to research and uncover, the artifacts.
Yes, as it were. I'm not familiar with the exact textbook, but seemingly it's not a zilzul in Avram Avinu that they're doing. It's a style, you call it a
Yeah.
stylistic choice that they are choosing to call him Abram, Abrhm, or Abram, Avram instead of Avraham, and it's a stylistic choice. It's a linguistic
So
choice.
is that ultimately what the Minchas Yitzchak paskins? Is he paskin
Yeah,
lahak on that
seemingly
basis?
he seemingly says, "L'chachila, you should not do this," but if it's already been done or it's already written, it doesn't seem like there's an isser to read this. And because he quotes here from the right, he quotes from the Maharsha, where the Maharsha doesn't seem to ever bring this Isser down. Maharsha talks about how this is not really brought down halacha anywhere, um, and that maybe it's an asmachta. It calls it asmachta be'alma, um, but that this
Right.
halacha.
Certainly it makes sense that it would probably be in a smachta. I mean, again, it's like hard. I mean, I'm not saying I have a good Bekias in all of the Monei Hamitzvos, but I can't imagine any of them actually count as one of the 613 as far as I'm aware. I could be wrong. Listeners, if you're aware of one of the Svarim that counts this in the 613, do comment and let us know.
Yeah, so ultimately he errs on. Ultimately he seems to paskin that l'chachila you should not do this, but definitely if you have a child with a nickname based on Avram's name, it
Mhm.
doesn't seem to be a problem. To all the Avramis out there who were just vindicated.
Right, you don't have to go and go change your name this Shabbos. But what I'm curious is, this does sound like on the face of it a rather technical question. Can I say Avram? Should I get rid of the textbook or not? I imagine to you as someone who, of course, is very knowledgeable in Torah, but as your day job teaches English and history also, or
Used to teach history. My academic background
uh,
is history
oh, and
primarily.
history and teaching English now. So you're very involved in teaching from these textbooks. So what to you is the broader takeaway from this kind of tshuva?
So I mean, I think there's a lot you can take away from this tshuva, and there's one reason why it's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
In terms of why I love this tshuva so much, and even though it's even among the tshuvas of the Minchas Yitzchak, it's not one of the most famous ones. When I think of most famous Minchas Yitzchak tshuva that I'm aware of, it might be the one that he sort of, in contrast to Rav Moshe, which is your wheelhouse more, seems to, I'd say shoot down, but seems to disagree with Rav Moshe's heter on sherry cask whiskey. In the Mincha, and even to this day, the Bate Din in England, in Manchester, and I think even the London-based Din are very machmir when it comes to sherry casks.
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty much almost all the mainstream contrast agencies have adopted that position. Kudos to them because most people just take Ramosha's kulas, not his chumras. So I mean, they don't take like a makir position. When he has like his chumras, that's the one I want to see people take. But many people take his kula. So here they didn't take his kula on it. So I have to give them credit where it's due. You didn't just like wholesale take Ramosha's kulas.
Correct. So, but to me, what makes this tshuva stand out is that it's not just a halachic issue. There is a bigger, more,
Hmm.
call it sociological, call it more like issue of the zeitgeist that he's dealing with here.
Yeah. Yeah, unpack that for us.
Sure, absolutely. So at the end of the tshuva, he speaks more broadly about issues of translation and the issues of translation of Torah and other, holy Jewish texts into non-Lashon HaKodesh languages.
Hmm.
So he quotes here, so he talks about here how when the Septuagint was written, and a question of whether Targum Shivim means Septuagint, and again, that is beyond my pay grade and perhaps beyond the scope of this podcast. But when he talks about how when the Torah was translated into Greek, and he brings it, there's a story of the Zakanim who were brought to Talmai Melech to translate the Torah into Greek, and then we know from the Gemara Megillah there's somehow a nace, and that they all come up with the exact same translation, even though they were put in separate rooms and had no communication with each other. But he talks about here how there were Gimel Yamim Choshech Ba'olam after the translation, and he quotes a Chasam Sofer here that which talks about why was there Choshech why was there 3 days of Choshech, which
Right,
again is
what's so bad about translating? You think like, oh, great, more people can access the Torah now. What a beautiful thing,
yeah, and
right? We have
also when we think
ArtScroll
about
nowadays.
for sure when we think about Gimel Yom Choshech, it seems to be a clear reference to Makav Choshech, which we're dealing with in Parshas Hashavua in the
Hmm.
past weeks. Gimel Yamim Choshech, and the Chasam Sofer asks a question on this that we know from Sefer Yosipon and the Sefer Mar and Ayim that the Jews were very happy, or at least some of them were happy after the translation of the Torah into Greek. And if you look in I have the edition here of the Sefer Yosipon that came
Ooh,
out.
you got your own Josephus over there. Look at that.
Stephen Bauman came out with this new edition of Sefer Yosipon. Remember that Yosipon and what we call Josephus are not lo oto davar necessarily.
Hmm.
Yosipon is a Jewish. I say, Josephus himself was Jewish also.
Yeah.
A later medieval adaptation of Josephus. And Sefer Yosipon seems to speak somewhat highly of Ptolemy HaMelech, who ordered the translation. In me quoting from here from his translation, Ptolemy the Macedonian, who was made king over the kingdom of Egypt, was a wise and prudent man who loved reading books. Perhaps we can all
My
relate
kind
to
of
that.
my kind of guy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great. Chicago,
It doesn't sound so bad after all.
yeah, he was a wise man who loved reading books, and to him, okay, you could say already there's a problem that Torah to him was book.
Ah,
And it's to to someone who's not doesn't have a Torah education and doesn't really understand the gravity of Torah and revelation. Well, that's obviously a problem. But at the end of this chapter, chapter 12 in Yosipon, it talks about how the king was after they translated, the king was very happy, and he gave a lot of wealth to the Jewish community after gave a lot of wealth to the Jewish community after the translation was completed. He seemingly rewarded them for having done this.
well, he sounds so appreciative. You guys made an art scroll for me. I'll pay for your time. Shalom al Yisrael. I'll call Yoshvei Tevel. Beautiful.
Yeah, give him a plaque in a shul or something.
Yeah, get a black in the shul or something. Yeah, exactly. So, okay, so what do we make of this?
So that the so Dayan Weiss, based on this Chasam Sofer, rejects this whole idea of happiness. Why were the Jews being happy? Doesn't seem like this is a reason to be happy. And he talks about how to him this to him represents, and I'll quote from the actual tshuva itself, that as hichu am b'nei Yisrael litom tam pshuto shel mikra umeaz huchal happy courses lihis notzetz velo avu shuv shomea lekol divrei chazal ulpirushaim.
I guess the issue is once you give open access to everyone. I mean, you see this. I don't pay attention so much to it, but when I go onto Twitter or X, whatever you call it now, there's like this group of anti-Semites who like to cherry pick passages out of the Gemara that are not so flattering, and they post it everywhere. Now, I wish. I wish Halavai, imagine they'd be posting like Tukfu Kohen and like they'd be posting like all these great sugyos of like Arbavos Nazikin. Like Halavai, that's what people would be sharing around. But that seems to be the concern is that there are certain parts of the Torah that if the general populace finds out about it, they don't have the proper understanding and context for it, it could lead to terrible results. I mean, in fact, even in that Medrash in the Gemara Megillah, talking about the translation, the sages deliberately rendered words in a way that it wouldn't be insulting to the king.
Correct. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think here what we're really dealing with is less maybe anti-Semitism, because even since, at least from the medieval period, we have stories of especially apostate Jews telling Gentile rulers, by the way, you know what it says in these Jews Gemara, you know what it says about, let's say, Oso Ish in the Gemara, that seemingly the concern here is internal. That
Hmm.
once you start translating, you start to you want pshuto shel mikra, and again, coming from this very small c conservative Hungarian background, pshuto shel mikra seems very threatening. It seems very
You're saying
threatening.
is they'll dispense with the interpreter, with the rabbi, with the chacham, the sage, who will give them what is the religiously acceptable way to render and understand the Torah, and people will engage with it directly and come to problematic and perhaps inaccurate conclusions because
Correct.
they don't
Yeah,
have
I
the
mean,
training to engage with it responsibly.
absolutely. And we know that Dayan Weiss had Hasidic affinities.
Hmm.
And he was very close with Hasidic communities. And to this day, Manchester has a very large Hasidic population. When I think of Manchester, the contemporary times, I think of Rav Usher Westheim, who gave the hashgacha on Pashka's candies for many decades until he passed away. He was nifter during COVID. Um,
Barth Amos. I didn't, I never even thought like who was behind that.
So, anybody who
That
ever,
like that like influenced my whole childhood in
I was gonna
shul.
say, if you got a lollipop in shul, the city of Manchester and its Rabbanim are to
Winkies or
thank.
something. Was that also under Pashkas? They're behind so many of the things that I ate in shul. Um,
Possibly, but the idea being here that, Chassidus is a very, let's say, perhaps the way it's manifested in stuff now is perhaps very top down. You go to a Rebbe, the Rebbe is the vessel of wisdom and
mm.
knowledge and correct interpretation of all areas of Inyane Olam.
So
And
democratizing knowledge by definition means that you're breaking down the hierarchical structure of the top-down religious instruction. So that right, so that could be I see what you're saying. That could be like a little bit threatening to how things were always set up. Also, what I got a kick out of, I just want to make sure this was mentioned, was that toward the end of that paragraph, he quotes the Ben Ish Chai, who takes particular offense to those who would go so far as Hamatargmim divrei Hazohar Hakadosh l'lashon ha'amim. Those who would take something like the Zohar, the chief text of Kabbalah, and make something like that, which is esoteric, available. We're not just talking about Gemara, which is supposed to be from a Rebbe to a Talmud, but Kabbalah, which was always much more behind the scenes, and then putting that into the Rishus HaRabim for anyone to engage
yeah,
with.
100%. And we think now, I think, people who want to learn Kabbalah and maybe don't have the language skills or want a more academic translation of Kabbalah, the Daniel Matt, the Pritzker edition Zohar from Stanford University Press is, I think, a staple in many libraries, a staple in many Jewish libraries. My edition is somewhere on my shelf. And that, yeah, the Zohar was translated into
But
English.
you know what's interesting these days? Are you familiar with? I think I've seen like even apocryphal works like Sefer Maccabeim. There's like now like these like firmer translations that are
Yeah,
becoming popular.
so to me, and I think this is where really wanted to get to, is how Dayan Weiss has this very, like I said, small c conservative way of how Torah knowledge spreads. You want Chazal involved every step of the way. You want Rebbes, you want Talmidei Chachamim, sort of guiding you to proper interpretation, proper understanding. And he quotes here also from the Noda B'Yehuda when the Chumash was translated into German. The Noda B'Yehuda tore kriya over this. That
Wow. So it was like the Septuagint again, whether it's Septuagint or not, but like all over again. The Targum Shivim all over again, just into
Yeah,
German
that
this time.
Torah in German, was not a good thing. That
Right.
you should be reading it if you can read it. You read it in the original with read with Divrei Chazal, whether it be Medrash, whether it be Gemara.
So here's what's so interesting because, perhaps the most iconic example is Art Scroll got Haskamos from the Gedolim before they printed. Now you have, like we said, there's like the From version of Sefer Maccabeim. I think you might even have one on your shelf somewhere.
Yeah, I have it right
For
here.
those on YouTube, you could see it. You could see it on your screens, and otherwise, you could just believe us that he's holding it. There's all these like from translations coming out now, and I guess the distinction that you would argue is that one is coming from the halls of academia, from outside of our religious, traditional, authoritative framework. And these translations are being authorized and vetted from within, making sure they're in line with the ethos of traditional Jewish religious thoughts.
For sure. And
Um,
I look here at this new edition of Sefer Maccabeim Beis that came out just in time for Hanukkah this year.
mhm.
What's you guess you call it a yeshivish edition, and you look at the
But it's
skamas
so
that,
funny because you think like if you're like really from, you're not going to read apocryphal works. Arguably, those are considered sarm chitzonim. So it's funny that you would engage with that. I guess you wouldn't consider it to be kadosh per se. I guess it would be like almost like a storybook. Like I'm trying to think like who's the market for this? Like who's engaging like with a from translation of an apocryphal work?
yeah. So I mean, I don't know, but I can just tell you the haskamas that he has here. Among them, Rav Asher Weiss, Shlita, um, Rav Yehuda Fisher from the Eda Charedis,
Oh wow,
signed off on an edition of Sefer Maccabeim. So
remarkable.
even, I mean,
That feels like a significant shift.
yeah, 100%. And this is something to me as someone who's fascinated by sociology and the way ideas develop over time and trends in the Orthodox community that I think, with so much respect and kavod to Dayan Weiss, that I just don't think the Olam Paskins necessarily like him, and that the fact that even very Haredi circles want things like a new translation of Sefer Maccabim with charts and pictures, and they want to understand the realia even of Tanakh, which was deemed, that you don't, maybe you do a little bit of academic Talmud, you do a little, comparing Gersos in Rishonim, whatever it is, but that you don't touch Tanakh. But there's a new book that came out. I'm forgetting the exact title. So maybe it's called Uncovering Yehoshua, something like that, but from a Haredi press, and it has pictures of archaeological sites in Eretz Yisrael. And and
It's
it really is trying to create almost, yeah, almost, they want people Haredi people who read Sefer Yehoshua.
and it makes sense. You could value having, a traditional worldview, a traditional hashkafa, but there's no conflict with just trying to understand the Torah in a more holistic fashion. And this is an argument I think I listened to an interview, a previous guest we've had, Rabbi Gilstone, but I heard him on a different one where he was arguing that sociologically, as the modern Orthodox world, some elements become more liberal. Some parts of the Haredi world are becoming what modern Orthodoxy could have been, maintaining the staunch obedience to halacha while also engaging with real Torah Umada.
Absolutely. And I'll just, maybe finish with a
Yeah,
story.
let's conclude with this.
So my shul rabbi, I guess shout out here to Rabbi Ben Skidel from Congregation Or Chaim on the Upper East Side. We're both big supporters of Beagle Eisen Bookstore in Borough Park. So Professor David Henschke from Israel, who's a big scholar in Talmud and Rishonim, but fundamentally an academic, from Jew, well, a Talmud of Rav Shlomo Fisher from Itri. Rav Shlomo Fisher's that's all, no small man. But in his book Mani Shtana, which really does an academic deep dive into the Haggadah and the origins of the Haggadah, the development of the text of the Haggadah, and certain minhagim of the Seder, really with academic methodology at its core. Rabbi Skidel told me that when he was in Bigleisen, the man in Beagle told him that the book, when they had copies, it sold out in like 5 minutes.
Wow,
And that,
there's a real market.
yeah, there's a real market in even Haredi circles for books that are deemed academic in nature. And I can just say, anecdotally for myself, when I've been there, they've seemed to always got, new editions of Rishonim that might be critical editions. They always seem to have books that might have been at one point on that non-Orthodox world might have, accepted as things worth learning from, but that even in more Haredi circles now, they are starting to appreciate the realms of academic
So I
study.
think that's like a really helpful anecdote to conclude with, which is, how much of it is really a principled opposition to using academic insights versus how much of it is almost branding. We're not going to go off on a tangent in the last 2 seconds of the podcast, but I always like wonder, like if we, some parts of the TNET community, if, like we didn't call it a yoetzet halacha, but we call it a yoetzet halacha. I wonder, how many more people would have felt comfortable with it. So there's a question of how much is branding, but I think people who want to understand Amita Shel Torah, they're going to be open to this. And clearly, as you said from your anecdote, they exist. And I would conclude by saying V'chein Yirbu. Rav Zachary Shlita, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for sharing your expertise with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Rav Kurtz. Always a pleasure to speak to you, whether virtually or in person. And you should be very matzliach with the podcast and everything else.
Amen. V'chein Lamar.